Hello.
Well, hello there.
Well, hello there. Have you seen that joke?
Welcome to Something Real, the home of professional podcasting.
It's as good as it's going to get. That's what the t-shirt needs to be. That on the front, and then as good as it's going to get on the back.
Beautiful.
As good as it gets. A movie with Helen Hunt and
Nicholson. Yep. Indeed.
Only saw parts of it. Because I can only listen to Jack Nicholson talk for so long.
I fell in love with Helen Hunt when she was the girl quarterback on the, it was a TV thing that she made.
That's such a boy thing to say.
It was something.
She was the girl quarterback.
The name was something like that. I can't remember what the title of the movie was, but it was something very similar to that, the girl quarterback or something like that. It's been a lot of years.
I'm going to look up Helen Hunt's IMDb.
She was a kid. I was a kid. You know.
We were all kids.
We were all kids. Not you. You weren't thought of yet, but God knew you.
Aww.
Yeah. So anyway, as we are...
Helen Hunt did not know me.
She did not.
She's only 58. I thought she was older than that.
She's just a little older than me.
She's still a kid.
But then one of my favorite shows in the 90s was Mad About You.
Yeah, Paul Reiser.
Which I tend to call Paul and Jamie if I'm talking about it in casual conversation.
I watched that show.
It occurs
Probably
to
shouldn't
me,
have, but...
as a youngster.
As a young
well,
child.
one of the better things about it was, even though everything on television was liberal, they were married. So as they dealt with a lot of sexual topics, but they did it in the context of marriage. So that made it better than a lot of the other ones, better than Friends and some of the others. And Paul Reiser was hilariously neurotic,
she's been on a ton of things. Twister.
I forgot about Twister. Yeah.
Oh, I love Twister.
Helen Hunt was annoyingly neurotic. I did not enjoy her character about probably 40% of the time. But she was really cute, and they were funny together, and so that's that. It occurs to me that we did not do a sound check before we got going here, and based on our last video experience, we probably should have done that. I want to apologize to any of you who watch on YouTube or Facebook. Due to technical issues, Facebook did not occur, and YouTube was a disaster in the audio. So I don't know if it's deleted yet, but it will be at some point. But the audio version on Anchor, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, wherever you get your podcasts, that audio version
is
clear
clean.
and sharp. So
she played Mary in a cartoon version of The Nativity Story.
Interesting.
In 1987. I can't find the football thing you're talking about.
It was a TV movie, and I cannot think of the
If you know what it is, leave a comment.
There you go.
Because I'm not going to look it up again. Because she's been in too many things.
She's been in a lot of stuff.
You go, Helen Hunt.
A lot of stuff. Not that old, but long resume. So, anywho, that has very little
0.00.
Actually, it has a little bit to do with it.
You're going to talk about Mad About You and how they were married?
Well, yes, because we are talking about Christian submission in marriage, and one of the things that was an issue, I think, in all of those 90s marriage sitcoms, really in almost all of them, from the 70s to now, is the concept of roles within marriage not even existent. And so for the most part,
you always have like the dopey husband.
Until you go back to black and white stuff, you look at and some of those were so stereotypical for the time that they were kind of a caricature of it. And you look at like Leave It to Beaver, which I loved. Right, it was a great show. I was watching reruns because I'm not quite that old. But anyhow,
Donna Reed night. That's for Heidi and Maisie.
As we were watching that was not a picture of a lot of households. Actually, it was a picture of a lot of households at the time, but it wasn't really a picture of what we see in the mutual submission and the husband and wife roles in Ephesians chapter 5.
Right.
Because there was just an air of superiority that you would see there, that the woman was somehow a little less.
And looking back,
not that the roles were the roles that were played as far as the housewife and the man who goes out to work, not that those are bad, but there was a sort of a typical American but not necessarily biblical attitude about it. And now we've gone so far the other way.
Well, that's what I was just going to say. I think people look at shows like Leave It to Beaver now and think it's almost comical how things were because it's so different from what we're doing today,
Right.
or and people think I just said it's Donna Reed night. That's from a Gilmore Girls episode, and it's kind of speaking to that. There's an episode early on in the show where Rory, who's the young daughter, she's dating this guy, and he has grown up in a family where his mother cooks and cleans and takes care of the household, and his father goes off to work. And so he's asking Rory, his girlfriend, why can't she be more like that? Like, because she's this, bookworm, independent, whatever.
That's a
not a great thing to say to
always
girls.
goes over well.
Here's some advice, guys. Don't. So he's asking her, what's wrong with that lifestyle? Why can't, because she's so against it. And he goes, well, what's wrong with it? What's wrong with a woman wanting to make her husband dinner? Blah, blah, blah. So she puts on Donna Reed night, and she dresses up in the Donna Reed style dress and makes him, a pot roast or whatever, and makes him his dessert and whatever, and waits on him and everything. And he realizes...
Was this supposed to convince him that it wasn't a good idea? Because that sounds great to me.
Well, she was kind of teasing him
like
about
pot
it,
roast a
but
lot.
I don't know what the moral of the story was. But basically, he said, you don't have to.
They needed an episode.
You don't have to do this. I was just saying. And she goes, no, it's actually not so bad. So that was her. They both kind of came to different conclusions. She's like, I don't really mind doing this.
Right.
But he was like, you don't have to do it all the time.
You and I were talking earlier in the pre-show, Something to Rant About. Follow our non-existent Patreon. You can get on there. But
pay us to complain.
Anyway, but we were talking about just the fact that so much of what we do and how we view things comes from what we're taught in the culture. And so, for Gilmore Girls, which was what, early 2000s?
Early 2000s, yeah. I think it started in 2000.
Where our society was, and the expectation of the roles in marriage, and of women in particular, but of the roles in marriage, dramatically different.
Sure.
I think we could say from the 50s and early 60s.
Yeah.
It's fairly safe to say. And so if you watch Leave It to Beaver, that was perceived by most, or even Dick Van Dyke, which was more of the sophisticate New York scene, more liberated type people. But so many stereotypes of the time that were considered pretty normal. I mean, Laura was, seen by many to be a pretty liberated woman in Dick Van Dyke. And
it's interesting how these generational, even in pop culture, I guess I hadn't lived through a lot of those things, but I wonder. I'm not saying you've lived through the Leave It to Beaver era, but how
coming from the aftermath of that,
how in step were they with what was actually going on at the time in
Sure.
the real world?
It was pretty much, as art often is, it both imitates and directs life.
Right, but there's also a formula for like the sitcom, the classic sitcom.
Yeah, but you can only use it when it works. Then you have to change the formula.
Like for some reason,
I'm thinking you couldn't do Leave It to Beaver today.
Right,
that's a different formula.
Like for some reason, I'm thinking of the Cosby Show.
Right.
And Claire Huxtable, she was a lawyer, and she was
broke the mold on so many things.
Right, and so that kind of just sticks out in my mind. And then I think of the '90s husband and wife sitcoms, and the first thing that's popping into my head is King of Queens.
Right.
And she worked an office job too, and he was a UPS driver.
Look at how things flipped from Leave It to Beaver to King of Queens.
Right.
So
she was the breadwinner.
Not so much in the Cosby Show.
It was kind of even keel. You kind of felt like they were equals.
But with like King of Queens, you've come to a place where every husband, every dad, basically every man that wasn't somebody's fantasy, but every regular man in every sitcom, they were the buffoon. That was the whole job. The whole reason for Kevin James to be there is to be an idiot.
And they were usually married to like a smart, pretty woman.
Right. And so you've totally flipped.
Right.
So the picture then was that the women were superior to the men.
Right.
And that's acceptable to say.
Right.
It's not acceptable to say that men are superior to women. Not even in weightlifting, apparently. But the reality is you saw that
I sent it to you.
That's what you said. The individual did not qualify, so kind of sidebar. But anyway, as we're looking at how things flip, that has not much to do with objective reality or objective truth, but what is the cultural vibe at the time?
Right.
And so
today I don't even know what that really is.
Well, now
it's certainly not what it was in the 90s.
It's offensive in many circles for a woman to be a stay-at-home mom, for you to be a
Yes.
homemaker as your chosen career that is looked upon in many, I would say most circles, as really,
Even though-
you're harming our gender by doing that.
Even though there have been multiple studies and research done to say that stay-at-home moms and homemakers are really working like 100 hours a week and should be paid this much salary based if they were working like, quote unquote, an actual job. The work that they do is, almost incomparable to anything else. So
now you
quit knocking on stay-at-home moms.
You have me jumping off script here a little bit because we have a script, right?
Oh.
Yeah. Anyway, but since we're talking about marriage roles and submission in marriage and the difference in the picture, very often we, even in the church, we take our cues from the culture or from the traditions that have been passed on to us more than from the scriptures. And so we, in Ephesians 5, and we'll talk about that in just a few minutes, you see some very specific roles for men and women. But you can't avoid the fact that men and women are equal in value, because that's really been the point for all believers throughout this letter. And if you look at Paul's other letters, like Galatians 3, for example, in the last part of that chapter, he's very clear and specific when he says there's no difference between male and female in Christ.
Do people just skip over that?
People skip over a lot. It's astonishing that 80% or more of those who profess to be Christians in America, of evangelical Christians, have not read through the Bible. So it's astonishing to me to think of how many people that really is. So anyway, I was actually surprised that the number who had was, or claimed to, was that high. But anyway, going back to the Old Testament in Proverbs 31 specifically, and I think a lot of church-going folks, if you're in evangelical world, you're familiar with Proverbs 31 as the chapter that talks about a virtuous wife or noble wife. But I think most of us get it completely turned around. And I know, my wife was in some studies when we were younger. I don't know if it was an Elizabeth Elliot study, but anyway, the women leading it were basically that, they were giving the picture that a woman needs to sit with her hands folded and listen quietly to her husband at all times and never do anything and never be assertive and never work outside the home.
How'd that work for Shelley?
She wasn't thrilled. No, and so she had an aversion to this particular chapter whenever people would bring it up, because when you bring it up, I will say I don't know that I understood it as well then. I will tell you now, you bring it up wrong. If you think this is that a woman should never speak and just be the June Cleaver kind of situation, although June had her moments of standing up at times too, but if
I like
you
Donna Reed
think
better, and It's a Wonderful Life.
if you think you're supposed, or Edith from All in the Family, which was deliberately kind of over the top. Not I don't know if I'd say
Archie
satire.
Bunker was over the top too.
But yeah, they were deliberately trying to show how the traditional couple that has to go by the wayside because you're missing everything. And so, Edith, he called her dingbat all the time, and he mistreated her. There is nothing in that marriage, although they did have a profound affection for one another.
Right.
But there's nothing in that marriage that looks like the biblical picture of a man and woman, even though they were church-going people to whatever extent.
That was a time period thing.
Right, and that was part of what Norman Lear was bringing out, not because he knows Christ, but because the hypocrisy was evident. Anyway, so that idea that a woman should just understand you are second place. You need to recognize that you are second place and just accept that role. That's not what the Bible teaches. So listen to what it says. This is Proverbs 31, starting with verse 10. And of course today I didn't bring my glasses, but as we're going through this, listen to the things that this woman is doing. It's not the picture a lot of people received in their women's Bible study. A wife of noble character who can find. She is worth far more than rubies. Her husband has full confidence in her and lacks nothing of value. So we've only gotten 2 verses in. We haven't really gotten into any details. and you're seeing that the husband doesn't look down on her as someone that he has to kind of carry. He has full confidence in her. And because of her, he lacks nothing in value.
Well, I'm saying she is worth more than rubies. That automatically puts you
this
up
value
here.
is huge. So, and if you go back to the Genesis account, it wasn't good for the man to be alone. So God created the woman so that they could be together, and her value as a helpmeet, which is a term that a lot of evangelicals will like to use. Again, I think weirdly sometimes as if you're a second-class person, and that's not the picture at all. You are the one that makes his life.
You complete me.
Well, in a sense, even though I have real issues with that term in marriage, but there's a sense in which God's plan, the reality of God's plan, intends for men and women to complete that plan together. That we are to be walking through this life in that way. So her husband has full confidence in her, lacks nothing of value. She's worth far more than rubies. Verse 12, she brings him good, not harm, all the days of her life, which, think of how regularly it's just like the national pastime to Alfalfa had the He-Man Women Haters Club. We've kind of gone the other way where it's just bash men all the time. Men are stupid, men are jerks, men are stinky. Women are everything and glorious.
Not always wrong, but
not always. In fact, I think I just said some of that myself on Sunday. But anyway, verse 13, she selects wool and flax and works with eager hands. She is like the merchant ships bringing her food from afar. So this is a picture of her working in the home, but already developing this idea that there's a certain commerce to this. She's eager to work. She's not a lazy housewife. Paul actually condemns that in the New Testament, that they need to get to work. Tell these young women they need to get to work and stop sitting around being busybodies and gossips. Okay. Because that was a problem for them at that point.
Seems very 1950s to me.
Well, it was very first century apparently. So
everything is cyclical.
So now you have men doing that. Let's just sit around and be busybodies and gossips. She's like the merchant ships bringing her food from afar. So he's comparing her to these. We might think of commercial ocean liners now, but something similar in a BC version of that. She gets up while it is still dark. She provides food for her family and portions for her servant girls. She has servant girls. We don't want to miss out on the fact that she's actually running an operation here.
Right.
This is not, let me just sit around and eat bonbons and watch soap operas, which, that was the picture when I was growing up, even in the 70s. That was what people were rebelling against, was this idea. And half of them were rebelling against it, and the other half were like, hey, don't mess up my system here. I got a good rhythm going. She gets up while it's still dark. She provides food for her family and portions for her servant girls. She considers a field and buys it. Out of her earnings, she plants a vineyard. This is not the picture you might have had from Proverbs 31. She's doing things.
She's a businesswoman.
In the home first, but also outside the home. The overflow of her work as a homemaker is also entrepreneurial. There's business going on. So she is independent in that sense. She's doing these things with her diligence and with her wisdom. She is out considering, she's actually evaluating, she's not just doing this on behalf of her husband. She's going out, looking at the property, deciding this is good, this is bad.
Buying it with her earnings.
I'm going to buy it. Out of her earnings, she plants a vineyard, right? So she buys land. She takes her earnings,
surveys land,
and
buys it,
invests that into planting a vineyard. Which I can tell you right now, she's got her servant girls. She's directing traffic here. She is not going to be the only one out there doing the planting.
Right.
She's going to be planting, but she's running an operation here, and that seems very evident from it. Verse 17, she sets about her work vigorously. Her arms are strong for her tasks. So it's not, this frail
weak
little
little
woman. There's no pretense here that she has the same physical strength as her husband.
Right.
And the Bible's pretty clear about recognizing that the physical, I'm going to deliberately use the word dominance, the physical dominance of the male is to be subjected to the good of the female for her protection and service. And the strengths that the woman has are not the same as the physical strengths of the man, but she brings other things to the table that are also to be subjected to the good of the husband and the good of the family, of the group. So there's a mutual submission.
I think I've said this before on the podcast, and you've never seen it, My Big Fat Greek Wedding.
No, I have not.
Don't yell at me for not seeing The Patriot.
I will watch it.
Because that's literally on TV every weekend, or it used to be, My Big Fat Greek Wedding.
Yes, but I don't get that stuff
I don't either anymore.
So.
But there's the mom.
We've cut the cord.
The matriarch of the Greek family, she says.
But I do use Windex a lot, if that
Put
helps.
some Windex on it. The matriarch of the family says that the man is the head of the household, but the woman is the neck, and she can turn his head.
That's not in any way, I don't think, illegitimate. I mean,
right.
there is reality to that, and there's if you watch history,
which I do.
Men have fought many wars and sat on many thrones. But through an awful lot of it, it was women behind those thrones directing or sitting next to them in the queen's throne. Women directing it. Helen of Troy, wars fought over that face that launched 1,000 ships. You see throughout medieval history, you look at what happens in the history of England, the prominence of women, whether they were actually ruling or ruling by in a de facto way by controlling what was being done or influencing what was being done.
Queen Mary of Scotland and that whole situation.
Right.
Like, whoa.
So
anyway, yeah.
So the idea that history has just been this completely lopsided patriarchy, not quite the way it's been portrayed to us. Has there been a patriarchy? For sure. Has it always been some toxic thing? Definitely not. Have there been times when it has been horrifically toxic? Absolutely. And one of the things that changed history was the influence of Christianity in the Roman Empire that gave value, gave worth, didn't give value, recognized the intrinsic value of women and children, of human beings, as being created in God's image. That was part of the Jewish scriptures. They'd kind of lost that to a certain extent. Not universally. I could be wrong about that. My understanding is it wasn't universal, because very little is actually universal except sin. But Christianity then brought out a whole other level of that through the teachings of Christ, through what we see in these New Testament letters. There's an elevation of women beyond what was recognized in the first century or those surrounding times. Now, over time, because again, sin is the one universal thing that we all deal with, over time we saw that get distorted again. So while slavery was something that Christians didn't fight against politically the same way, but recognized the intrinsic value of slaves as people, as humans, and did fight to free slaves from the beginning, that later on became distorted, and people would use scriptures to justify slavery, to justify domineering husbands mistreating their wives. None of that is actually reflective of Scripture or the will of God. Well,
it's kind of bringing it back to the Ephesians thing, and I'll let you finish the passage in Proverbs there, but I think the big distortion with the passage we covered in Ephesians today even is women see it as submit to your husbands. Well, why does the Bible want me to be the weaker party in this? And men see it as you have to submit to me, I'm the man. And that seems, I don't want to say antiquated, but it wasn't even the Bible. I mean, you can't get more antiquated than the Bible, and it's telling you to do a certain thing. So where did that stem from, that idea that the man, unless it's just a complete misinterpretation, where did that idea stem from that the man is, some all-powerful, I need to bow down to you, blah, blah, blah. And the woman is I need to do whatever my husband says.
Darwin.
Because clearly this isn't saying that.
Seriously, Darwin. Now, Darwin wasn't the first to say it, but the same principles.
Well, I don't like it.
Before Darwin, had his theory of the origin of the species, the natural law of survival of the fittest, the dominance of the strong, that predominated always throughout all of human history. And so, because the reality was, and it's don't email Stacey, email me if you're mad about it. The reality is, as a general rule, physically, men are significantly stronger than women. They are, they're designed for that. And so
with that way of thinking, we're just part of the food chain.
Basically, yeah. Well, and so are men. They're just higher in the food chain. Right. And so as you're dealing with those things from a purely secularist, naturalist perspective, you can't embrace the idea of natural selection and not recognize the male of the species for humans, and for most, but not all species, as the dominant, physically dominant species. Well, if your worldview says that if I can do something, I have a right to do it, or even that I should, if I am stronger, therefore might makes right, I can do what I want, it's not really hard to put two and two together and recognize that men were going to dominate. Sinful men dominating a sinful race and holding their dominance over sinful women.
That's funny to me because so many people look at the Bible and think that.
Exactly.
And it's the opposite of the Bible.
Right. Well, it's again, we were talking previously off camera that there are so many things that we see as normal these days because that's what the devil wants to do. So he wants to convince you that you are this, this struggle that you're having, this sinful thing that you've done. It defines you. That's who you are. And the Bible says something completely different. But the devil wants to keep, when you're still a sinner not in Christ, the devil wants you to believe that you're good enough and strong enough, and everything is great. No worries. Don't think about anything. You're not a sinner. You've got truth within you. You have a God within you. And the devil loves for us to think those things. But then when you come to Christ, he wants to keep you paralyzed by saying, boy, you know how you blew it yesterday? That's all you're good for. You're pretty much just worthless. You should just give up. Just stop trying. You can't really be saved. If you were really saved, you wouldn't have these thoughts. You wouldn't give in to these temptations. You wouldn't make these dumb choices. All of these different things that
he sees an opening, even when you're in Christ, and he knows he can't have you.
Especially when you're in Christ. He's already got you before that.
Right.
So he doesn't really need to work that hard.
Right.
I own you. I don't have to worry about that.
And I think I
want to go get more.
Right. I think I've asked you before, why would he bother? And your answer was like, because he's the devil. And he knows, the devil knows what's going to happen here. But
pride and hatefulness.
He's going to get his kicks while he can. And,
that's a good way of putting it.
And so, I think since he hates Christ followers so much, he's going to do whatever he can to torment you.
Yeah, and that's the thing. He can't take you out of God's hand.
Right.
He can't steal your salvation. But if
he
he can get you to live
miserable.
like that,
right.
He can't own you.
Right.
He has no power over you because he has no authority over you. And the all-powerful God has the authority and says, you are mine. And if you are mine, can the devil take you out of his hand? Of course not. Nothing can take you out of his hand. But if he can get you to live like it, if he can get you to
or even think
like the slave you were, instead of the emancipated, freed person who is a fully adopted, wholly accepted, dearly loved child of God, if he can get you to think like who you were instead of who you are, so that you sit on the couch and grouse about it, that's the next best thing.
Right.
If you're paralyzed by your shame and your guilt and your fear and I might as well stop trying to resist sin because I keep blowing it, so I'm just going to give in. I'm not really good for anything else. I feel like garbage, therefore I must be garbage. That's what the devil wants to do. Right. And so he loves, as we talk about so often, he loves to swing that pendulum. So to get us, on the one hand, believing that men are better than women and women need to just sit back and take it. and then we swing it the other way, and women are better than men, and men need to just sit down and shut up and get out of our way and stop holding us back, when the reality is you're both sinners saved by the same grace, or not saved. But if you come to Christ, it doesn't matter if you're male or female. You have the same value because you have the same Lord. But the Lord assigns different jobs to each person.
Those are dangerous pendulums, I think.
Hugely, yeah.
And they manifest, I think, in different ways. For men, I think they might try to throw their power around a little bit, or their dominance.
Right.
And that can lead to abusive relationships, or whatever. Or men being, I make all the money, so I'm going to control everything you do, or whatever. And women being bitter and
I'm not going to put myself in that situation, so I got to make some money to protect myself from them, which is an absolute death blow to marriage. If you are not trusting one another completely with all of your finances, if it's not all together, then your life isn't built together. So why does that go wrong? Because people are sinful, and we don't understand marriage. We don't understand God. We don't understand ourselves or how these things work together. If we do it His way, it works great. If we do it our way, it is a disaster.
And that's one of the reasons, I'm assuming, is why marriage seems so disposable these days. Yeah. People getting married 3, 4, 5, however many times, because they think, well, if it doesn't work out, I'll just get a divorce. And then it's just so easy to get married, get divorced, get married, get divorced, get married, get divorced.
And even more so nowadays, people just not getting married.
Well, right,
live together,
true.
Buying houses together. Because I don't want to commit to marriage, because that's too hard. But I'll put my entire financial future in your life, and we'll be legally tied, having children together, not married, because that's, as you know, that doesn't go away, right? Even when you're divorced, you're still forever tied to one another by this new life that came from you, and that can't go away. It doesn't just suddenly disappear. But when we go outside of God's plan for marriage, sexuality, and family, and we start to act married, doing things like cohabiting, being involved sexually outside of marriage, that is like so passe in our society that nobody, even in the church, can even nobody's going to do that. That's just not realistic. That is the standard that God has set. And anything outside of the covenant of marriage is an affront to God. It is offensive to Him. It is destructive to the individual, the family, and the society. And when we downplay that as something to joke about, then we lament 90s purity culture, because how dare you say that you should remain pure until you're married? You're saying that the rest of us are somehow less because we're involved. And the image has come up a couple of times of a youth pastor or conference speaker who said, well, you're kind of like, now you're like a used car. You've got miles on you and so on. And that is an offensive thing to say. Mm-hmm. At the same time, it's not altogether untrue. And it doesn't diminish your value as a human being, but you did take something precious and use it as a toy. You did not do it God's way. That's for any of us. And the recognition of the fact that most of the people hearing this, most everybody in our churches, did not remain pure until marriage. We don't live in a pure society. So even for those who remained virgins until they were married, they were inundated with impurity and did lots of other things that was in their mind, and they gave away an emotional intimacy that was designed for marriage. So there's a lot more weight to this than we want to put on it. And we live in a hypersexualized society, which acts like sexual pleasure, the physical aspect of it, is the only thing that matters. It defines all of us, who you're doing it with, and how often you're doing it, and all these different things. What you're doing. All these different things, this defines you, and nothing matters more. In America, we're throwing away, or trying to throw away, constitutionally defined rights to create a new idea of these sexually defined rights that are being assigned outside of science, logic, Constitution, certainly outside of the Bible, and that's all that matters. The only thing that matters is sex. Turn on the television. I can't turn on I can't think right now of anything not on a kids channel that I could actually watch with my daughter in the room without having a deleterious effect. One Calls the Heart. You're right. Although the commercials on Hallmark Channel are going.
But if you record it, you can fast forward through that.
So these are the difficulties.
Right.
But even Gilmore Girls, you
right.
know, there's so much in there,
and not even kids shows. That's what I sent you the other day.
You know, that's a fairly, I don't know, what's the word, sedate. It's a low key kind of show.
Right.
It's not like it's
it
over
was
the
on
top
the CW
racy
in the 2000s,
or anything like that.
It's not.
Oh, I don't know if that's your best standard, but you know.
But I mean, it was on public television.
Right.
It's not like on HBO.
It's not R-rated
right.
kind of stuff. But the norms, the mores that are in there are worldly views of human life and sexuality.
Right.
And so,
as you said, art imitates reality.
Right.
That's
exactly.
What's going on.
And it keeps that ball rolling.
Right.
So while it's imitating life, it's also directing life.
Right.
We're you know, people do more of this because they see more of it on television. This is why the LGBTQ advocates want to see a higher representation on television, a higher representation in the Olympics. I was listening to that this morning. I want to say it's 168 out of 11,000 people that were identifying in some way as LGBTQ currently in the Olympic athletes. And I'm like, we need more representation. Or maybe representation of the nation whose team you're on is the point, and not your individual group.
Somebody had made the suggestion the other day after this. Laurel Hubbard was the man from Norway, I think.
New Zealand,
that competed in weightlifting as a woman, transgender woman. And I'm sorry, I'm not meaning to be offensive. I just don't know what to say. They failed all three of their lifts.
I will not capitulate to the language.
They failed all three of their lifts. Like, I watched the video. He dropped 2.
If you've watched powerlifting or weightlifting at all, if you know anything about it, you have to get an opening lift to be able to go in there. And so
right.
if you go in and you overestimate yourself and you get something that's too heavy, you know, I used to coach lifters when we go into the competition. I'm by no means some experienced coach, but you know, we put together a small little power team. We were over at Edwardsburg High School lifting, and my guys were not going to compete with these big studs that were out there. I said the number one thing you got to do is you get a weight that you know you can get,
right.
that you've got a lot of times.
Right.
Get your clean weight, get it up, so you've got something on the board.
Right.
Because you don't know if the guy that's stronger than you is going to do exactly what Laurel Hubbard did and DQ.
They dropped, I think, 2 of them and got DQ'd for the other one, or didn't count or something. And so somebody said, and it really looked like they didn't even try.
Right.
But
missed the technique or something.
Right.
Yeah.
And so somebody suggested, I saw online, that the only reason that person got in was so the Olympic Committee could say, look how inclusive we are. Yeah. We were the first, big games thing to have a transgender person, blah, blah, blah.
That is a goal of the Olympic
Committee. And that could very well be, because frankly, that spot could have gone to a woman from New Zealand or another country.
The woman who got bumped from
right.
that spot from New Zealand
right.
was not particularly happy about it.
I'm
was
sure.
told when Laurel Hubbard began competing as a woman, was told you either need to drop to a lower weight class, or retire. And the reality was she could not lift as much as Laurel Hubbard could lift.
Big surprise.
Who had been out of weightlifting for 10 years.
15,
used to compete as a man.
Yeah.
It's over a decade. And is 43 years old and getting better by comparison. Well, yeah, because you're not competing against comparable
right.
genetic advantage. Mm-hmm. So now, as you're coming into this, you're coming against women in their prime,
right.
and they don't have the physical advantages
right.
that you have. Anyway, we didn't.
I didn't mean to get on that track, and we got to wrap this
far.
up. But I just wanted to touch on that as far as roles went for men and women.
Yeah. So the whole thing, because we are at the end of our time here, we kind of built out the concept a little bit from 2 previous sermons and from Ephesians 5 specifically. If anybody wants to see more of Proverbs 31, you get the point.
Sorry,
you can go and check that out yourselves. But it's not some mousy doormat of a woman that's being portrayed here. But it was a woman who recognized how to appropriately submit to her husband's authority.
I'm going to take a second look at that.
In love.
For sure.
Not in any way diminishing her own personhood and nowadays there's like a battle against femininity,
right?
So that
people want to be feminists,
right.
But you're
so
not
the answer,
feminist.
because men were jerks through a lot of
Right.
history, the answer is let's be just as big of jerks as them.
Yeah, cool.
Because men were philanderers. The answer isn't get men straight. No, instead, let's us be philanderers
Right.
too. Let's wear
anything you can
foul
do, I can do
words.
better.
Exactly. So you take what has been
Let's
found
put reproductive
disparaging
organs
words
on our head,
and you wear those as a badge of honor, and you put out podcasts bragging about being a particular derogatory term as if that's something to champion. It's bad. It's bad for men. It's bad for women. It's bad for children. It's bad for society. We need to stop. We need to understand that God's design is the right design, always has been, always will be. But we also need to not put human understanding on God's design. We need to not read into the text, but we need to draw from the text. What is it that God's actually saying? What is he expecting? And everything that we read here in Ephesians 5 about the submissive role of the wife and the sacrificial love role of the husband is not to make one dominant. In fact, it's exactly the opposite. And they're an explanation or a fleshing out of chapter 5, verse 21 that says, submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. And everything else that we see is a picture of that. He talks to wives and husbands. Next week he'll talk to children and parents. And then after that he talks to slaves and masters. And so as we're working through these ideas, two things that we needed to look at as kind of a foundation for it. One was that God designed marriage, sexuality, and family to illustrate his relationship to his people. That is a theme throughout the scriptures. He uses that illustration, that word picture. Two of my favorites are Isaiah 54, where God says, I will be a husband to you, speaking to Israel. And in the book of Hosea, where he calls the prophet Hosea to marry an unfaithful woman who then is publicly unfaithful, essentially ends up in a trafficked type situation, and Hosea goes and redeems her and brings her back. You are mine, and you're going to come home and live with me, and he buys her out of her slavery. And he does that, and God did some tough stuff with these. Think about it. Talk about living out your assigned role. God assigned this prophet, his mouthpiece to the people, to marry an adulterous woman who is going to run around on him. That ain't good. That's not a comfortable road. So whatever you think is unfair that God's calling you to, it's probably not as unfair as what he called Hosea to, knowing before he got married that was
Isaiah, right?
Hosea.
Hosea?
Yeah, Hosea. Isaiah was the other one.
Okay.
But it's he went into it knowing that's what's going to happen.
Right.
Because that's what happens between God and his people.
Right.
And so he's using that illustration. So then the second element that we needed to see going into is that the right relationship of authority and submission is essential to the Christian life. We talked about that last week. That was kind of the point. It's built into everything. Right. So God uses authority and submission in the natural realm to be, and for sure in the relational realm, to demonstrate the spiritual reality of his relationship to his people so that we understand him better. There's so much more that we could talk about. We could take weeks to go over it, but
I have to go get my child.
Yeah, eventually we're going to have to, get to the end of the stuff. But the idea that we see here in Christian submission in marriage is that it reveals Christ's relationship to his church. In marriage in general, it's showing this picture of God and his people. But when we're talking about the Christ follower, you're specifically assigned roles in this cosmic play, if you will, to portray the church. The woman is to portray the church. So the way she handles her submission to her husband in that role, and submission out of reverence for Christ, that's a conscious decision. That is teaching true discipleship to her children, even to her husband, and to everybody around. When the husband is loving his wife as Christ loved the church and laying himself down for her, he is portraying the character of Christ, so that everybody who sees him should see an accurate picture of Christ. If we don't get this right, this is everything. This is huge for discipleship and evangelism, and it requires the heart of Christ, as we talked about in Philippians 2, to, even though regardless of his equality with God within the Godhead, his equality with the Father, he didn't cling to. He didn't grasp his godness, but he laid it down. He emptied himself of that, as the hymn says, emptied himself of all but love. And he took on the form of a servant, died in our place on a cross, humiliated, mistreated by the very people that he was dying for. That's a pretty huge deal. That's a picture of how we are supposed to submit to our roles in marriage and in the family.
We are going to stop there, but as always, if anybody has any questions or comments about what we talked about today or the passage from Ephesians, we'll be happy to discuss it at a later date, bring it into another podcast. I think everything kind of overlaps anyway. So yeah, if you guys have any questions or comments, feel free to email us at somethingreal@reallifeonline.org. You can leave us a comment or message on Facebook or YouTube, or leave us a voicemail at 269-756-RLCC, or if you use the Anchor app to get your podcast, you can leave one there. And I think that's, aside from bringing the carrier pigeon back, that's all we got.
Good. It's as good as it's going to get.
As good as it's going to get. Thanks, everyone.